first time Sheriff Ray Caldwell stepped into the crime scene on Millhaven Road, the air smelled wrong. Not the typical metallic tang of blood or the sour stench of fear he'd grown accustomed to over the years. No, this was different damp wood, like something pulled from the belly of the earth. It clung to the walls, settling deep into his lungs. The crime itself was puzzling enough. A neat line of candles burned down 2 stubs, arranged in a half circle around the victim's body. A teenage boy, eyes wide open and frozen in terror, as though he'd seen something so unspeakable that death had been a mercy. Ray rubbed his temples, his frustration mounting. It wasn't the first strange case that month. In fact, this made the 4th, and they were getting progressively weirder. 2 weeks earlier, an elderly woman had been found wandering the streets barefoot, mumbling about whispers in the walls. Her home, when searched, revealed nothing out of the ordinary, except for a single mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces and the words, "I am here," scrawled on the frame in something too dark to be ink. The week after, a local mechanic had driven his pickup straight into a utility pole, swearing afterward that a shadowy figure had appeared in the middle of the road. No alcohol, no drugs, just terror, plain and unfiltered, in his bloodshot eyes. And now this. A dead boy. A macabre setup that felt less like a crime scene and more like an offering. Got any theories yet, Sheriff? Deputy Hayes asked, breaking the silence. He stood near the doorway, one hand on his belt, the other gripping a styrofoam coffee cup, like it might keep him tethered to reality. Hayes was young, too green for something like this. His eyes darted around the room as if the shadows themselves might lunge at him. "No," Ray muttered, crouching to get a closer look at the body. The kid's fingers were curled, his nails caked with dirt. He'd been clawing at something, maybe the floor, maybe his own throat. But it's got a pattern. We just don't see it yet. If it was a pattern, it was buried deep. No shared connections between the victims, no clear motive, no fingerprints or DNA left behind. Just fear pure, raw fear etched into every scene. Later that evening, Ray sat in his office, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The case files were stacked haphazardly, pages spilling out like confessions. He thumbed through them again, searching for the thing he knew was there but couldn't name. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, his voice gruff. Dr. Eleanor Kane stepped inside, her presence as sharp and deliberate as the heels clicking against the wooden floor. The town's psychiatrist, Eleanor, had an unsettling way of looking at you, like she already knew all your secrets. She placed a folder on his desk without a word. "What's this?" Ray asked, eyeing the folder warily. "Notes from my sessions with Abigail Kemp," she said. Abigail, the elderly woman from the second case. "You might want to read them, Sheriff. Her descriptions. They're specific." Disturbingly so, Ray opened the folder and scanned the first few lines. His stomach tightened. Words like shadow, presence, and its watching leapt off the page, chilling in their simplicity. "I thought she was delusional," he muttered. Eleanor shook her head. "I don't think she is. Whatever's happening to her, it's spreading." Ray's hand hovered over the file for a moment before closing it with a sharp clap. His instincts told him two things. First, whatever was happening wasn't just in Abigail's mind. And second, it wasn't going to stop. "Keep digging," he said, meeting Eleanor's gaze. "There's a storm coming, and I need to know what the hell we're dealing with." Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, high-pitched sound of whisper, almost too soft to hear, danced on the edge of the night. Sheriff Ray Caldwell didn't like bringing outsiders into town business, but desperate times had a way of forcing his hand. By the time he reached the beige brick building housing Dr. Eleanor Kane's private practice, the morning sun was barely cresting the horizon. He adjusted his hat and stepped inside, the door jingling against his unease. Eleanor sat at her desk, papers neatly stacked, a coffee mug steaming by her side. She looked up, her expression betraying both curiosity and caution. "Twice in 1 week, Sheriff. You're starting to worry me," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't worried myself," Ray replied, dropping a manila folder on her desk. "You said something the other day that stuck with me about this." Spreading, Eleanor leaned back, her gaze sharp. "I did, and I meant it, but I wasn't expecting you to come asking for my help." Ray shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, I'll be honest, I'm out of my depth. I don't like it, but it's the truth. This isn't some petty burglary or drunken brawl. These crimes, they're not normal. And I think you know that." Eleanor regarded him for a moment, her fingers steepled under her chin. "What exactly are you asking of me, Sheriff?" "I need your expertise," Ray said bluntly. "You've got a reputation for solving tough cases, for getting inside people's heads. I need someone who can make sense of this mess before someone else gets hurt or worse." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't one for flattery, but she could see the weight Ray carried. "These aren't just crimes to you, are they?" "They're personal." Ray hesitated, then nodded. "A kid died. Whatever's going on, it's tearing this town apart. I can't just sit back and watch." Eleanor stood, pacing slowly. "I'll admit, the details you've shared are unusual. But if I agree to help, you'll need to give me full access to the files, to the scenes, to the people involved. And you'll have to trust me when my methods don't line up with your badge and gun approach." "Done," Ray said without hesitation. Her brows lifted slightly. "That easy. I don't have the luxury of pride right now," he said. "So, what's your take?" "Based on what you've seen so far," Eleanor sat again, folding her hands. "The pattern isn't in the actions themselves, it's in the psychology. These aren't random outbursts or disconnected events. Whoever or whatever is behind this is deliberately playing on fears, preying on vulnerabilities. It's methodical, almost surgical." Ray frowned. "You're saying this isn't just one person losing it?" "I'm saying," she replied carefully, "that it's either the work of someone extraordinarily manipulative or something worse. Either way, they're leaving a psychological footprint in their wake. I'll need to see the scenes, talk to witnesses. The more context, the clearer the picture." "Fine," Ray said, standing. "I'll pick you up tomorrow morning. Wear boots, it's muddy out at Millhaven." As he turned to leave, Eleanor stopped him. "Sheriff," she said, her tone softer now, "you know this might get worse before it gets better, right?" Ray paused in the doorway. "I'm counting on it." The door swung shut behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with the file. She opened it, her eyes scanning the photographs and reports. A strange unease crept over her, the kind she'd learned to trust. Whatever was happening in Ray Caldwell's town wasn't just a string of crimes. It was something darker, deeper, something that whispered of intent. The air inside the old farmhouse on Millhaven Road was heavy with decay and silence. Dr. Eleanor Kane stood at the edge of the crime scene, her boots sinking slightly into the warped wooden floorboards. The sheriff stayed close but silent, letting her work without interruption. Eleanor's sharp eyes scanned the room, the candles, the strange half-circle formation, the dirt under the boy's nails. She knelt by the body, careful not to disturb anything. Her fingers hovered over the claw marks on the floorboards, then the boy's frozen expression. "He wasn't running," she said softly, mostly to herself. "What do you mean?" Sheriff Caldwell asked, breaking his self-imposed silence. Eleanor looked up at him. His body position, his hands its defensive. He was warding something off, not trying to escape. Whatever he saw. He felt trapped. Ray frowned, his jaw tightening. You think he knew the person who did this? Eleanor straightened and stepped back, her gaze drifting to the half-circle of candles. Not necessarily. Fear this raw, this visceral. It doesn't need familiarity. It needs power. Whoever or whatever was here had complete control over him in those final moments. Ray rubbed the back of his neck, glancing at the boy again. This doesn't feel random, does it? No, Eleanor replied. And it's not. It's psychological warfare. The setup here isn't just for show, it's for effect. They're crafting an atmosphere, creating a sense of inevitability. Fear isn't just the byproduct of these crimes, it's the goal. They left the scene an hour later, the sun sinking behind the hills. Back at the station, Eleanor spread out the case files on a large table. The sheriff joined her, the two of them poring over photographs, witness statements, and forensic reports late into the night. Eleanor spoke first, her voice steady, but tinged with urgency. The victims don't seem connected on the surface, different ages, genders, backgrounds. But look deeper, and you'll see a thread. Each of them was dealing with some kind of psychological vulnerability. Ray leaned closer. What kind of vulnerabilities? Abigail Kemp, the woman with the shattered mirror. She'd been battling loneliness after her husband's death. The mechanic, divorce, financial troubles. And the boy. She hesitated, flipping to his file. According to his parents, he was being bullied at school. Severely. All of them were in emotional states that made them susceptible to manipulation. Ray's eyes narrowed. So you're saying whoever's behind this is targeting people who are already vulnerable. Why? Eleanor met his gaze, her expression grim. Because fear feeds on weakness. It's easier to control someone who's already teetering on the edge. This isn't just about killing, it's about domination. They're breaking these people down, one by one. Ray nodded, his mind racing. If that's the case, we need to figure out their endgame. What's the point of all this? Eleanor flipped through more pages, her fingers stopping at a photograph of the shattered mirror. They're leaving traces, not physical ones, but psychological. Each crime feels like it's building toward something bigger, like pieces of a puzzle. If we can figure out what they're trying to achieve, we might be able to stop them before it escalates. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. And you think there's a pattern to it all? Eleanor nodded. There always is. It's just a matter of finding it. 2 days later, the breakthrough came. Eleanor had been analyzing the locations of the crimes, cross-referencing them with psychological profiles of the victims. She noticed something chilling. Each crime scene was situated near places the victims associated with safety or comfort. Abigail's home, the mechanic's favorite fishing spot, the boy's grandmother's farmhouse. These aren't random locations, Eleanor told Ray as she pinned a map of the town to the wall. They're deliberate. The killer is corrupting spaces that the victims considered sanctuaries. It's another form of psychological warfare, taking away their safe havens. Ray stared at the map, his stomach twisting. But why? What's the point of all this manipulation? Eleanor turned to him, her voice low. Because they're building fear. Piece by piece, victim by victim, they're creating an atmosphere of terror. And I don't think they're finished. Ray's gaze darkened. If we know what they're doing, we can predict their next move, right? Eleanor hesitated. Maybe. But we're not dealing with someone operating on impulse. This is calculated. They're always one step ahead. We'll need to think like them to anticipate their mindset. The sheriff squared his shoulders. determination hardening his voice. "Then let's do it. Let's get inside their head and stop this before anyone else gets hurt." Eleanor nodded, but a flicker of doubt crossed her face. She didn't say it out loud, but the thought loomed in her mind. What if it was already too late? Sheriff Ray Caldwell didn't think much of psychology before all this started. He believed in hard evidence, fingerprints, DNA, eyewitnesses, things you could hold up in court. But as he watched Dr. Eleanor Kane scribble notes on a whiteboard in his office, connecting names, behaviors, and locations with lines of red ink, he realized they were chasing something far more abstract. "The key isn't just in who they're targeting," Eleanor explained, tapping the board with her marker. "It's in why they're targeting them. Vulnerability is the entry point, but there's a deeper motivation at play. This isn't just random cruelty. It's purposeful." Ray leaned forward, arms crossed. "Purposeful how?" Eleanor took a deep breath, then pointed to the word she'd circled earlier: power. "They're not just instilling fear for fear's sake," she said. "They're testing the limits of their control. Each victim was carefully chosen because they represented a challenge, a chance for the killer to push boundaries and refine their methods. They're getting bolder with each crime." Ray stared at the board, his jaw tightening. "So we're dealing with someone who thinks this is a game?" "Not a game," Eleanor corrected. "An experiment. They're building something, a legacy of fear. And they won't stop until they feel they've perfected it." Ray grabbed his hat and stood. "Then we need to end this now. What do we have on them?" Eleanor gestured to the profile she'd sketched out. "They're methodical, organized, and highly intelligent. Likely someone who blends in, who's unassuming enough to gain access to their victims without raising suspicion. They're also incredibly observant. These attacks require intimate knowledge of their targets' lives. Someone who watches, who listens." Ray's eyes narrowed. "A local, then. Someone who's been here long enough to know the town and its people." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "And based on the escalation, I'd say they're preparing for their next move. The question is, who's next?" Ray's radio crackled to life, interrupting their conversation. "Sheriff, we've got a report of suspicious activity out near the old Jenkins property. Neighbors say they heard chanting, saw lights in the woods." Ray exchanged a grim look with Eleanor. "Looks like we've got a lead." The Jenkins property was a forgotten relic on the edge of town, its crumbling barn and overgrown fields swallowed by darkness. Ray and Eleanor approached cautiously, the sheriff's flashlight slicing through the dense shadows. The chanting stopped as they neared the barn. Ray motioned for Eleanor to stay behind him, his hand hovering over his holstered weapon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wax and smoke. Candles lined the floor in precise, deliberate patterns. At the center of the room stood a man, his back to them, dressed in simple work clothes that belied the malice in the air. Ray's voice was steady as he called out, "Turn around." "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, then slowly turned, his face eerily calm. He was middle-aged, unremarkable, someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But his eyes gleamed with something unnatural, a twisted satisfaction. "You're too late," the man said, his voice steady, almost amused. Ray stepped closer, gun drawn. "I said hands up." Eleanor, standing just behind Ray, spoke softly but firmly. "He wants you to react, Sheriff. Don't give him that satisfaction." The man smirked, tilting his head. "Smart woman. But tell me, Doctor, how do you stop something you can't understand?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice calm. "You're wrong. We understand you. Every fear you've sown, every life you've broken, it's all about control. But you're not invincible. You're desperate." The smirk faltered. "Just slightly." but enough for Ray to see it. "Hands up," Ray repeated, his voice cold steel. This time, the man obeyed. Back at the station, the man revealed to be a local handyman named Warren Pike sat in the interrogation room, his calm demeanor unshaken. Eleanor watched through the one-way glass, her mind racing. "You think he's going to talk?" Ray asked, joining her. "Not willingly," Eleanor admitted, "but we don't need him to. The evidence at the barn is enough to link him to the other scenes, and his demeanor fits the profile he thrives on control. Losing the control will unnerve him more than any questioning ever could." Ray nodded. "We've got him then," Eleanor sighed, the weight of the case finally settling on her. "We've stopped him, yes, but there's still damage. The fear he created that doesn't go away overnight." Ray looked at her, his expression softening. "Maybe not, but people will sleep easier knowing he's behind bars." "And that's a start," Eleanor nodded, though her mind lingered on Warren's parting words as they'd escorted him out of the barn. "You stopped me, but fear has a life of its own. It doesn't need me anymore." Those words haunted her as she left the station that night, the cold December wind biting at her skin. Ray watched her go, tipping his hat in a silent thanks. The town was safe again, but both of them knew the scars would remain, etched into its foundation like a shadow waiting for the right moment to return. The aftermath of Warren Pike's arrest brought a strange quiet to the town of Millhaven. People spoke in whispers as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace that had settled. For weeks, Sheriff Ray Caldwell found himself catching snippets of conversation at the diner, at the hardware store, even at church. The general consensus was relief, but tinged with unease. Pike was locked away, yet the shadow of his crimes lingered. Dr. Eleanor Kane stayed in town longer than she'd planned, assisting with victim counseling and debriefing the sheriff's department. It wasn't just about tying up loose ends. It was about understanding the ripples Pike had created. One evening, she and Ray sat on the front porch of the station, watching the last light of day fade over the hills. "You think he'll talk eventually?" Ray asked, breaking the silence. Eleanor shook her head. "No, people like Pike don't crave redemption, they thrive on the chaos they've caused. Confession would mean relinquishing control, and he won't do that willingly," Ray sighed, tipping his hat back. "Well, at least we stopped him before he got to his next victim. That's something." "It is," Eleanor agreed, her voice thoughtful. But this case wasn't just about Pike. It was about the system that allowed someone like him to slip through the cracks. There were patterns in his behavior long before he escalated to violence. If someone had intervened earlier, maybe. She trailed off, letting the thought hang in the air. Ray nodded slowly. "You're saying this town needs to look at more than just locking people up. We need to see the warning signs, deal with the root causes." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "The criminal justice system is built to respond to crimes after they happen. But if we worked more closely with mental health professionals, if we had resources to identify and treat people like Pike before they reach this point, it could save lives." Ray stared out at the empty street, his mind heavy with the weight of her words. "You're right," he said finally. "This case, it's changed how I see things. I've always thought of my job as catching the bad guys, keeping people safe. But maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's about understanding why the bad guys do what they do and stopping them before they even start." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's a good start, Sheriff. But it takes more than one person or even one town. It's a shift in thinking, in how we approach mental health, crime, and justice." "This case is a reminder of that," Ray chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You're saying Pike gave us a lesson in civics, huh? Damn ironic, don't you think?" "Terrifyingly so," Eleanor said, standing and dusting off her coat. But if we don't learn from it, what's the point? In the months that followed, Ray began working with neighboring towns to establish better connections between law enforcement and mental health services. Eleanor returned to her practice, but she and Ray kept in touch, sharing updates and ideas. The case of Warren Pike didn't just leave scars on Millhaven, it left lessons. It reminded the town that understanding the human mind, even in its darkest forms, was just as important as catching the criminals themselves. And while Ray knew that fear, as Pike had said, had a life of its own, he also believed something stronger could grow in its place: understanding. For him, that was enough.